This podcast is free, and it's accessible to everyone thanks to support from listeners like you. If you value this show, please consider supporting its production by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute to give, and you'll be helping to support the production of this podcast. Make a donation at kuow.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thanks!
Chinese Americans aren't particularly known for showing affection. When I grew up, my father was particularly proud of not having hugged his children. This changed when my dad started teaching at the public university in my hometown and spending more time with young people besides me. His students were appalled at the absence of affection between father and daughter. So when I came home for the first time from my freshman year of college, I was utterly shocked to be welcomed at the airport with a quick and stiff hug. Byron Ouyang's relationship with his dad was like that too. They were never particularly close.
Not much communication. I mean, no hugs, no kisses, none of that.
This isn't uncommon for Chinese American families. Many children of the diaspora feel the physical remoteness of our parents. We live far from them, but we also grew up without caresses, embraces, or outspoken declarations of love as a norm. But being with his father's belongings and the things that his father touched during his life helped his son grieve the loss of a parent.
I'm Alex Schwartz.
I'm Nomi Fry.
I'm Vincent Cunningham, and this is Critics at Large, a New Yorker podcast for the culturally curious.
Each week, we're going to talk about a big idea that's showing up across the cultural landscape, and we'll trace it through all the mediums we love: books, movies, television, music, art.
And I always want to talk about celebrity gossip, too.
Of course.
We hope you'll join us for new episodes each Thursday. Follow Critics at Large today, wherever you get podcasts.
This is The Blue Suit, a podcast about the commonplace things that touch our lives and the uncommon people that transform them into something remarkable. I'm Xinyi Pai. Today, the Chinese Dictionary.
When I fold books, I usually try and find the center and fold from there.
Byron Ouyang folds paper. Byron picked up paper folding from his grandmother. She provided a source of comfort to him whenever he got upset as a kid.
Whenever I was, yelling or running away, she would always be the one to come and placate me and be like, understand or speak through things to try and understand, which was, really amazing if you think about it, because she didn't speak English. And I barely spoke Chinese.
In his childhood, Byron's grandmother cared for him and kept him company while his father worked long hours. Together, they folded paper offerings.
Right. It wasn't like, today, I'm going to teach you how to fold paper. It was never that. It's like, this is a practice that she's doing. And if I'm curious about it, then I can join her and she'll show me. The things I admire about my grandmother is it was always playful. She was always full of laughter.
By spending time with his grandmother, Byron learned about his cultural heritage and the tradition of folding paper. Centuries ago, the Chinese invented paper and have had a very personal relationship with it since. Chinese paper folding revolves around making objects for the dead. That might include objects like gold bars or items of clothing, anything the deceased might crave in the afterlife. These things were sent by burning them. For many second-generation Asian Americans, staying connected to a deeper sense of cultural identity is an ongoing struggle. Immigrant parents, like my own, often choose a path of assimilation for their kids. We became a primarily English-speaking household, and within one generation, the loss of language and culture created an almost unbridgeable divide. On visits back to Taiwan, I have vivid memories of sitting around the kitchen table at my uncle's house. I folded paper with my cousins while having long conversations about family. We folded junk mail and advertising circulars into unlidded paper boxes. We used these boxes to put the fish bones, chicken skins, and inedible gristle that accumulated at dinner time. But paper wasn't just commonplace. My cousins also folded lotus blossoms to burn on days when we went to the temple.
Oftentimes people are like, oh, you're doing origami. I'm like, oh, no, I'm doing zi-zi. It's like paper folding is as old as paper.
Byron didn't practice folding paper with his dad. It just wasn't something they had in common. Byron's parents divorced when he was 7, and one reason he wasn't close to his father was because they didn't live together all the time.
So my relationship with him was basically only on the weekends, and he was working really hard. So he got a real estate license in Seattle. Although what's interesting is every weekend we would be in a different place because he didn't have a permanent home. So my mom kept the home. We were either at a friend's place or house sitting or an empty apartment that was being sold. Or, I remember, I didn't know that this was unusual.
But one of the ways that father and son did connect was through music. Byron is a composer, and his experimental compositions have sometimes drawn upon the Chinese language to express the ideas at play in his work. The Chinese titles for his compositions always came through his father.
I would say I'm working on this musical work. Do you have ideas for a Chinese title? And he would think for a moment, and then he would, be recalling certain stories. And then he would consult this Chinese English dictionary to find the right characters.
Byron knew that whenever his dad wanted to consult the Chinese English dictionary on his behalf, that he turned to the specific green and white reference book that he always kept close at hand. Byron knew that as the eldest child in his family, he had to come home last summer.
So my father decided not to continue with chemotherapy. And so the doctor said, well, it'll be 6 months or less to live. And so once I finished the spring semester teaching, I came here to be with him.
When he arrived in Seattle at his brother Nikolai's house, he knew this would likely be his last opportunity to be with his father.
My immediate experience of walking into Nikolai's place was, my dad was sitting there, and almost as if waiting, and it felt pretty lonely, actually.
Byron helped care for his father until his death. As he spent more time with his dad, he realized he had many questions about his life, and so to learn more about him, he turned to his belongings.
Oh, this is just a thing of maps. I have no idea whose this is. I asked my brother. He thinks it might be my stepmom's. To me, when I found this, it's missing its cover, right? And then it has a bunch of children's scribbles on the back because it was an empty page. And
It feels like these different books, they reflect parts of his identity, as an immigrant.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of it is piecing it together too, especially for someone who didn't tell stories. He wasn't a storyteller. So my dad came with one suitcase, and I always think of him as a minimalist. And yet there's all this stuff.
His father kept old business ledgers, textbooks from his high school and college days, and newspaper clippings.
I remember finding a pile of stuff, and it was coupons and articles, and sometimes annotations of an article for one of my brothers, this may be of interest. And I think maybe that's something I know I do So I think maybe my dad was somebody who said, "Oh, I'm thinking of this person when I see this article." And so there was a collection of these random papers also, that had that he never had a chance to give to us.
Among his father's belongings was a 50-year-old calculus textbook inscribed with the name of a dear childhood friend, Kaisutsu, who had died before him. Byron found a list of song titles written in his father's handwriting. The neat handwritten script was too beautiful to throw away. As Byron examined the meaning in his father's papers and personal effects, he began to fold again, like he had once learned from his grandmother. Physically, it became a way to be with his grief through folding his father's belongings.
Okay, so I'll do this. And then I'll fold it like this. Right, so this pops out. And I find the paper folding, because it's meditative, it allows me to be with the memories of him in this, this repetition that actually calms me.
He opens one of his father's hardcover books to a random spread and folds over a page in half.
They're basic folds, like triangles, right, and rectangles.
As he continues touching the pages, he bends the paper into circular shapes. Fragments of language peek through the creases, becoming their own graphic elements, reconfigured into new meanings. The paper still glued to the spine of a book erupt into architectural forms as unforgettable as Frank Gehry models.
Basically, it's figuring out. And if you want to fold too, you can grab a book or something.
Byron didn't transform all of his father's papers. He turned away from folding documents related to his father's ties to an investment club. These papers felt predatory in their exploitation of immigrant dreams.
Yeah, I tore them up and recycled them.
But Byron did fold his father's financial magazines.
I mean, the magazines I ended up folding because I'm like, the content of like Money Magazine is questionable to me, but actually they're shiny and they are colorful because they can afford to be colorful magazines. And when they get folded, they totally transform. So I always try and do minimal folds, and then I try and find like a secret fold or a magical fold. I call it a magical fold.
Magical folds take things to a whole other level.
Okay, can I twist the paper in a way that all of a sudden gives it this spark that's like, whoa, how did that, right? And so it's not an ordinary fold anymore. It actually manifests into something more special.
For Byron, paper folding is not just about making shapes that take on sculptural dimensions. The material itself is important. It has to have had a life, actually been used by someone and discarded for him to fold it.
I won't fold pristine paper. If it hasn't been touched, written on, printed on, then yeah, I'm not. So, like origami paper packs, no, won't fold those.
Byron's objects aren't just visual curiosities. They are intimate records of objects that his father touched. Byron held on to these materials because they were part of his father's lived experiences. His father handled his textbooks. He dog-eared the pages of business magazines. He touched these materials over and over again. At the end of someone's life, touch almost reverts to a function of caregiving. We lift a body in and out of a wheelchair, sponge bathe the skin clean, lend an arm to support someone more frail as they make their way across a room. Upon Byron's return to Seattle to be with his dying father, he was welcomed with a handshake, a particularly long one.
I think that's why I was so surprised when I returned home. And he held my hand for like longer than usual and kept like shaking it and telling me how happy he was that I was back home. Like his saying, I miss you, I'm glad you're back, is like, that's as far. That was him saying, I love you. He's never said I love you.
Byron hasn't yet touched his father's Chinese-English dictionary. That green and white one his father always reached for whenever he wanted to find a certain phrase to share with his firstborn child. It had so much meaning for Byron that this book was the only personal object of his father's that he wanted to keep for himself. Byron will make something beautiful out of it when there's nothing left to fold. Check out our show notes to see photos of Byron and links to his work. Next week's object is a caliphone. The Blue Suit is produced by KUOW in Seattle. Our host, writer, and creator is me, Xin-Yi Pai. Caroline Chamberlain Gomez produced this episode. Special thanks to Matt Martin. Jim Gates is our editor. Tomo Nakayama wrote our theme music. Additional music was provided by Byron O. Young. Our production team includes Michaela Giannotti, Tio Popescu, Hans Twite, Melissa Takai, and Brendan Sweeney. Special thanks to the Windrose Fund for their financial support. If you like this podcast, KUOW has a lot more great audio for you. Search KUOW in your podcast app and see what piques your interest. Thanks for listening.
At Soundside, we bring you news and conversation rooted in the Pacific Northwest. Hi, I'm Libby Denkman. I think of my job hosting Soundside as, number one, asking tough questions of powerful people, the questions you, KUOW listeners, want answered. And two, bringing you a daily slice of the fascinating, confounding, and often goofy side of life in Washington State. Join me for Soundside at noon and 8 p.m. on KUOW or anytime on the Soundside podcast.